So this is going to be the first of two videos about creating two-way tables in Excel. So we have some data here. We have 21 people who've been asked their age and whether or not they're going to be taking an English class in the coming term. So initially we had ages in numerical values, but I've already pre-categorized these. When you build a two-way table, you want to be able to build it, generally speaking, with two categorical variables. Well, you can do this with some numerical variables. You don't want there to be a lot of them. There were too many values of age, and so we categorized them in order to turn them into just 4 or 5 categories rather than individual values. When you build a two-way table in Excel, it will give you one row for every category, and if they're numbers, it will give you one row for every different value of the numbers. So we don't really want our table to be quite that broken out. So pre-categorized age, yes, no, this is categorical data. And so Excel can pretty much do this more or less automatically, and there's quite a few features that we can apply in order to make this work. So if we go to Insert, and in Excel, the two-way table is called a pivot table. So we select that. We're going to select our data range, and we're going to select a location where we want our pivot table to appear. You just have to pick a cell value where the top left corner is going to appear, so you don't have to worry about the size of the table. And hit OK. Now what's going to appear is a dialog box for building our two-way table. So we need to put one of the categorical variables in the rows and one in the columns. Generally, it's better to put the categories that are larger, the variable with more categories, in the rows, just for the purpose of display. And I'm going to delete the blank. We're just more accustomed to seeing things displayed vertically. And then I'm going to put age in the columns, or sorry, English in the columns. And so this is our yes, no going across the top, our age categories. And then I need to do something in the body of the table. If I choose a categorical variable and drop it into values, then the default will be to count. Now, if I have a discrete variable, like say the number of children in a family, and I want to use that as the count, I do have to be a little careful. Sometimes the count will, if it's a number, will not count them, it will sum them. If that happens, select the drop-down arrow, value field settings, and then change from sum to count here in the table. But since this was categorical, it did automatically choose count for us. And so we have our two-way table. If I want to manipulate it, sometimes it can be helpful to paste a copy as values. You can do some of this directly in the two-way table, but this allows you to do things with a two-way table if I make graphs of it or things like that. And by modifying this or by changing the graph, I won't actually change the two-way table. Sometimes if I build a graph of this and I switch the rows and columns, it will physically change the two-way table orientation. So by making a copy of it, I'm a little freer to manipulate it. I can also manipulate the original two-way table without changing my copy. So instead of displaying counts, what I may sometimes want to do is display percentages. And in that case, again, I'm going to go to this drop-down box under Values, select Value Field Settings, and then I'm going to select Show Values As. And under here, where it says No Calculation right now, I'm going to change this to a %. Now, typically for a two-way table where I have data which is mutually exclusive, so I can I could be in one category in the rows and I can only be in one category in the columns, then I'm going to display percent of grand total. And so what this will do, this will convert all my counts to percents by dividing by the total, the grand total down here. There will only be one 100% in the table. Now, what will happen in a table like this is that you'll be able to read across each of the rows, this percent plus that percent should equal that percent. And if I add down, then this plus this all the way down will add up to this. So adding across or down the columns will produce the same sum in each of the entries. And so adding up here will give me 100, adding across here will give me 100, and so forth. So this tells me that I have 57% of my students who say they are not taking an English class, and 43% of the students approximately who say they are taking an English class. If I don't want all these decimals, I can adjust the number of decimal places. Either whole percents, or I can increase the number of decimal places, but 2 is typically a good number. Another option that I can use is I can create a marginal table. And a marginal table is going to have percents of rows or columns. If I calculate the column total here, then each of the columns is going to add up to 100%. But adding across the rows is not going to add up to 100% because this number, whatever this was, this count of 3, is the percent, 25% of all the no's, not of all the people surveyed. So I have an entire bottom row down here that it's all 100%. Typically, again, when you're building a two-way table, it certainly can be useful to look at percent of each category, but in this case, I generally just want to know this percent said yes, this percent said no, and this is the two-way table for a single question. Now, what we want to do in the next video in the sequence is we're going to look at slightly more complicated data on the other sheet. So these first two categories are the same, the age and the English question, but now I want to display in my table not only whether the person has said, yes, I'm interested in English, or yes, or no, I'm not, but whether they're interested in English, math, history, or science. So this will be a little bit more complicated. I'm going to do a little bit more of the work manually, but we're still going to use features of Excel to help us make the process a little bit easier and a little less tedious. And then we're going to talk about different ways to display that slightly more complicated type of data.